Well, today's episode is going to be a lot of information, and especially I think the parents are going to appreciate this one, but it's not limited to. I think we all have children in our lives, and we all have the inner child within us too. We are talking about the web, electronics, and the challenges that it brings this day and forth, how difficult it can be to navigate this ever-changing world. I was part of the last generation, it feels like, to not have to grow up with electronics as a primary focus in my formative years. And as I navigate this as a mother with my children, I think it's very important that I try my best to understand the challenges that my children and the children that I care about around me, which is really all children, how we can better navigate and understand this world. So I have Catherine Knibbs on as my guest today, and she really is such a great resource of information to talk about navigating growth through trauma, whether that be, exploitative images that are shared, how the school systems and social workers and whatnot may work together or not work well together, and all of the traumas and things that we can do to help avoid and or navigate the situation when, whether it be adults or children, face these, it's going to be something we're forced to navigate whether we like it or not. I'm going to read a little bit of Catherine's bio because I want you to understand how educated this woman is and how valuable I found her insight today, so that hopefully you can find the same value. She is a human behavior technologist, a psychotherapist, and a researcher. Kath is a clinical directorial researcher, online harms and cyber trauma consultant. She's also a public speaker and author of 5 books, and an educator and a TEDx speaker. She actually did a wonderful TED Talk if you want to search the web for that. She's just a phenomenal resource. So I hope that you guys are able to take away some precautionary things from this episode and enjoy the listen. Hello, Catherine. Thank you so much for being on the Built for Growth podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you today about a lot of different things. I think we're going to talk about growth through trauma, right? We're going to talk about a lot of the difficulties of navigating this world with electronics, and with your background and your specialty, which I would love for you to kind of just give a piece of that, how you became in your position where you are today and working with children as well as adults, and just give us a taste of, how you got to be where you are.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Misha. This is an incredible opportunity to talk, which I'm very good at. So I will keep it short. So I started off in the military, and I went to do a job around engineering, which included day sights, night sights, lasers, optronics, which is all about things that we use to see in the military, such as the thermal observation things. And then I came out of the army, was married at the time with 2 small children. And unfortunately, because I was in the military, I married into a kind of trauma relationship, and that ended. And really, I was kind of stuck as to what to do. So I went into the field of computing, as it was called then, IT and cybersecurity. And pretty much it sapped my soul. So I decided to go and retrain in psychology and then child and adult psychotherapy. So I did 2 courses at the same time. And I'm qualified to work with children and adults. So I do that here in my office where I am at the minute. And really, what happened whilst I was training to be a therapist is I spent a lot of time with the children in schools because I was supplementing my income. And I started to notice what my children were seeing, what the children were seeing in and around those environments. And that led to me really getting a specialism in what I call cyber trauma. And here I am 14 years down the line, working with children and adults in practice, but also being an author, a speaker, an educator about all things technology and the harms that we can face.
Yeah, it's exactly why I wanted to have you on here. I think there are many people maybe in the same time zone because you're over in the UK, right? Who I
Yeah.
could have talked to, but I followed you on Instagram for quite some time, and I'm like, this lady really understands it. I feel like it resonates with me, and as a parent of small children, it's something that I want to be aware of, and also for myself. I think you can never be too cautious. I think there are certainly things where adults can be taken advantage of online or have
Hmm.
certain things that we just don't want to have be as a part of our life, but it is, and it's difficult to navigate these things. So I wanted to ask you, what was it that you saw that your children were seeing, and maybe what was some of the most eye-opening moments for you?
So, if I tell you, my children are no longer tiny; they're full grown men. And what was happening was I was going into what we call primary and secondary schools here. So that's up until the age of 11, and then 11 to around about 16 to 18, depending on what age groups the school has. And I was finding that in the primary school age areas, children were mainly gaming. That was, and it still is to date. That's usually the hobby or the pastime that children engage in. But when you start getting to the age of owning a smartphone, so this is even in 2010, on average, a 10-year-old would have one of these smartphone devices. And what I was really seeing were conversations around people that you didn't know on the internet and who was contacting you. The material that children would share with each other in those days was generally videos, and there was a lot of websites that existed in those days. So it would be things like Ebum's World, which had lots and lots of silly songs, mimetic videos, things that children would use as common language. And then I started to hear about some of the things that children were seeing, and this is coming in really early on our conversation for me to start naming the harms that children were seeing in 2009, 2010, 2011. And they included videos of real life murders, videos of beheadings, videos of pornography, videos of animal abuse, videos of really unkind things, and what we now call cyber harassment, cyber stalking, cyber bullying, and all of the other names that we have. And really, it was trying to understand what was happening for children when they saw this kind of material. And that's actually led to a point of me now doing a PhD, which I'm almost finished in, around what happens when we see really terrible material.
That's a great question. That was almost going to be my next question because when we talk about trauma through electronics, I think a lot of times people think of exploitation,
Yeah.
but there's also a lot of trauma that can be had through viewing things at a young age that really imprint
Yeah.
in these children's minds. I'm so careful to navigate the best that I can what my children are exposed to, the shows that they watch,
Hmm.
but they're still 6 and 4. So I know that
Yeah.
it's difficult. And we were talking on a pre-show call about when they were together with their cousins and then they began watching this show. We were on a family
Yeah.
vacation and I was kind of like, look, we're on vacation. It's all right. It's a treat. Sure. You're going to get more time on electronics than you would normally get at home. That's all right. But they
Hmm.
started watching this show. It was Try Not to Laugh. And I wasn't aware of it at the time, but we went home and she said, Mom, can we watch Try Not to Laugh? And so I said, well, I'm curious about this. Turned it on and I thought it
Yeah.
was a terrible show. Um,
Hmm.
I thought it was terrible. I mean, not only did the screen switch every 2 to 4 seconds, but it was things like cars flying off of cliffs and crashing, and just things I feel like, especially at the rapid fire rate that they were coming to
Hmm.
my child's brain, that it's just stuffing their brain with so much at once. And you don't really know
Yeah.
how that's going to manifest. I think that's the scariest thing as a parent. It could seem harmless, You could say, well, it's not that big of a deal, but I also understand that children's neurons are building at such a rapid rate when they're at these
Yeah.
ages that they're very impressionable, and you don't really know
Oh,
how it's going to go or manifest. Did you lose an earring or a?
I've just lost an earring, so I'm just taking them out.
That's all right. Look lovely either way. Okay, so let's talk about that. The way that this could manifest in a child's brain. You know, an adult may have ability to decipher these things or not really let them plant the seeds that I think children, we
Mm.
have to be a bit more careful in how we navigate this.
Yes, and I mean, just to come in on that, in terms of, so we have in psychotherapy world or psychology, we tend to talk about the kind of critical phases. And certainly, right now, there is a bit of a hoo ha around the world around this phase of adolescence. But actually, if you look at what happens for babies and children, there are varying stages throughout developmental life. And in those stages, what we know, and this is through lots and lots of decades of research, which is missing from the cyberspace at the moment, is we know that certain things have a lifelong impact. We know that things really do impact you on a physiological level. It can have an impact on the way that your brain develops. It can definitely have an impact on interpersonal relationships, but it also has an effect on intrapersonal. So that's what goes on inside yourself. And certainly, what we know in the world of trauma is that when children witness violence within a home or I don't know, let's call them global disasters. We know that children who have viewed news over the years, and we certainly know from the material that we might call horror or slasher movies, that when children are exposed to that kind of material, it really, really does affect them. And we now live in a world where what you were alluding to used to be called fails channels on YouTube. And on those fails channels, it is, lots and lots of Schadenfreude. It's people having accidents. Certainly, they can be very graphic. And what's happened now is the regulation around those kinds of images and material isn't fast enough to keep up with it. So whilst you might be watching try not to laugh, you might be watching somebody get really hurt. You might be watching an animal get hurt. And for children, they don't necessarily know how to process that information. And of course, who do they turn to if one image is then replaced with another and another and another?
Right. It happens so fast. And
Mm,
do you think that it's important to talk to our children? Because I know that there's not going to be an entire way to avoid this. Eventually, my daughter will get to the age where she'll probably stay over at friends and she's going to have exposure whether I like it or not.
mhm,
So, what do you think
yeah.
is the best approach for me, maybe conversationally, to be able to talk to her where she's not going to resent me? And my son, is short to follow, but these conversations, how should a conversation between a parent and a child go in some situations like this?
Mm. So I'm trying to remember which book it's in. I think it's in the first one where I talked about. So this is the first book that's on a Kindle one in 2016, and then I've followed it up with. Well, we actually have lots and lots of television programs that are built around people falling into situations which might be considered, in air quotes, funny. And in the United Kingdom, we've had Game for a Laugh. We've also had lots of programs that show spaces and images like that. Well, what we're really trying to understand is empathy and compassion and care. So what I would do, certainly with my children, is they might laugh, oh ha ha ha, has fallen off his bike or his skateboard, and I would be inclined to say, well, yes, it's funny in the moment because it was not you, and that's a psychological process that let's not get into the weeds on that. But there is a psychological process of seeing somebody else be hurt that we can take enjoyment in, but also, ouch, didn't that person, after the video or before the video, did they consent? Did they say, okay, you can share this? Because actually, what we're really talking about are three levels of feeling, which, when it comes to working with children in the therapy room, it's very much about how I work with people. That we have embarrassment, which is perhaps where somebody did something slightly silly, they fell off a skateboard, and we can now look back at it that I only grazed my knee, and yes, what a silly Billy I was. And when the TV programs pay out, for example, £250 in this country for one of the videos that used to go to these programs, people will be inclined to share their embarrassing moments because it has a financial payout. But then comes, well, what about if the person didn't give permission to share that video? Would that then have a different impact? And if so, what are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about embarrassment anymore. We're talking about a deeper feeling, which is shame, which we can get into in terms of how that fits with cyber trauma. But also, laughing at the expense of somebody else isn't always a very kind thing to do. And the compassion that we have for animals when they get hurt and other people when they get hurt is something we can talk about with our children. So my go-to is always, and what do you think that person felt? And what do you think it was like for that person? And what would happen if you saw somebody fall like that? And why has nobody gone over to help? And why do you think? And why do you think? And why do you think? And really getting our children to engage in critical thinking, but also it's called in psychology the theory of mind. Put yourself in the other person's shoes and imagine just for a moment what that must have been like. And pretty much I would say that's the way that we encourage and enhance feelings around empathy, compassion, and care for one another.
I'm so glad that you went that direction with this. I was expecting something like building a relationship with your kids so that they'll come and talk to you about these things. But I think it's also important to remember the side that you were just talking about helping them to form empathy in situations and
Mm,
not just assume that every situation is there for that laughing moment or to make fun of or to just have no feelings about, like just not care
mhm.
that somebody may have had pain physically or emotionally. So thank you for that piece of information. So as we talk about growth through trauma, how do you help, whether it be adults or children, get through the traumatic situations, or maybe some examples that you have of people experiencing trauma through the web, through cyber experiences, and how are
Mhm.
we moving them through? What is the best way to help somebody?
Ah, so right now, Misha, there isn't really a lot of I want to go standard protocols or processes or the way that we tend to look at this, because what we're doing at the moment is we tend to, as you talked earlier with the exploitation, we tend to focus in on one particular aspect. So if it's exploitation and a child sharing nudes, then what we look at is um, what might be the trauma to the person if they were coerced, and then we might kind of zero in and focus on that. But actually we are talking about um and I'm going to go kind of with Gabor Mate's
I'm such a
definition,
fan
I
of his.
suppose, around trauma. And it's not the event, it's the what happened. How do we make sense of it? What's the story we tell ourselves about it? And for me, as a psychotherapist and kind of the space that I inhabit, I would definitely be saying, and what was the impact on my physiology? What was the impact on me internally? And who could I go to in order to work through that particular issue? And what I'm finding, certainly over the last 15, 16 years, is quite often children don't report these things, whether that's to a platform. They don't necessarily report it to an adult because they fear that the device will be taken away from them, or they will be told off for being on a particular website, or they've clicked on something they shouldn't have done. And we do this to the adults in the world of cybersecurity. We say, well, why did he click on the link? we do
We
this thing
place
where we
blame.
make an assumption. Yeah, we make an assumption that the other person had something to do with it to be traumatized in the first place. But one of the things, and I'm sure you've experienced this in terms of using social media, we are not privy to what is coming next in terms of our feed, and this is something I talked about on an interview that I did in 2014, where I talked about the autoplay function. And for me, that's where I see a lot of the traumas. Now, I can give an example of my own trauma where, so this must have been about 2013, 2014, and Facebook had just started the autoplay feature. So there wasn't a way to switch it off. And I was scrolling down my feed, and there was a video that had been shared by a younger person that was in my family. I clicked on it because I thought it was music related. And the next thing is actually the video was not what it appeared to be. It started off as a music video and then transitioned into something really quite horrible. And I, I'm going to be my normal self, sweary self here. What I did was I went shit, and then I kind of sat there for a minute, going, I wasn't expecting that. I didn't know what to do. And then when I complained to Facebook, one of the things that they came back and said at the time was because the comments on this particular video. So what I will describe is it was of a little boy who was being, let's call it, disciplined by his mum in quite a gregarious way. Was because the video was being shared and it was being condemned by the people in the comments, it didn't break any of the community standards. So because I'd had this personal experience, I had to then sit there and go, okay, what happened? How long did that take me to process? Who could I go to? What went through my mind? And so on and so on and so on. And I had to really sit down and go, okay, as a psychotherapist, where's the theory that would underpin what's happened? And then how do I explain this to other people so they can recognize it in children and they can recognize it in adults? And that then led me to have a conversation with one of my colleagues who unfortunately was sent some child sexual abuse material. And what she said is she also went through this moment where she was frozen in time, looking at the screen, and it took her about half a second, maybe a second, to actually be able to do something about the the situation before she quickly closed the platform, the app, and then emailed me to say, Kath, this thing's happened and here's what happened to me. And really that's where I started to notice that this cyber trauma happens in less than about half a second. And that's to do with how quickly your brain processes visual images. And when I'm working with people in the therapy room, we're talking about an instantaneous um, event. We're talking about an instantaneous reaction. Usually, it's withdrawal away from the screen, maybe a fraction of a fraction of a few centimeters. But then we have that moment: is what the heck just happened? And that isn't necessarily being understood. And I think that's where really I've started to write the books about, okay, all of these moments are incredibly distressing. All of these moments mean that we need to be able to talk about them. And sadly, even to date, and I know this is 2024, we have lots and lots of professionals who might turn around and say, well, just turn it off, don't go on it again. Oh, it can't have been that bad. And we use words like, well, when you're watching it through a screen, it's not the same as real life. So it can't have the same physiological impact. It can't have the same trauma reaction. And I'm kind of arguing and still arguing 10 years down the line, it absolutely does have the same impact. And that's because of the way that our brains work. And just to get a little bit technical, I'm going to say it's because of something that we have called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are when we see, and this goes back to that kind of fail stuff that you were talking about, Misha. When we see something happening to somebody else or to something else, because this also includes animals, our brain is able to work out that's painful, that was intrusive, that was violent, that was scary, that was shocking, and that all the things that we have that are negative emotions And negative emotions create a cascade of physiological chemicals that go through the body. And that's what we have to deal with, is knowing that people who see this stuff, whether it's online, on a phone, on an iPad, or even on a TV when you're perhaps cast into it, that this is about real trauma. It's vicarious trauma, it's witness trauma. We have lots of different names, but I'm tending to stick with cyber trauma. And that then means when I'm working in the therapy office, I have to go, so tell me the story. Tell me what happened before, tell me what happened afterwards, and tell me how you now perceive the rest of the world. Because often people will make decisions, they will have expectations, and they will tell themselves a story about how the world has changed. For example, and I'll give you the example to go back to the sextortion that we talked about earlier, or the exploitation. What often happens is it changes our, what we call a schema, our way of seeing the world. And for a lot of the children that have been coerced into producing images, sending images, not even knowing that they were being filmed, for example, that they now have a lack of trust. There's betrayal. Um, they make an assumption about all adults are, because this is what we do post trauma. So I think when I work with it, Misha, there's so many different factors, and I have to use the trauma recipe, if you like, that it's not about dealing with the trauma itself, it's about the person. And that includes, where were you, who could you go to, excuse me, and what does that mean for you in terms of how you now perceive the rest of the world.
Do you find that there is a big difference in the way that young people or children are dealing with this compared to adults and the rate at which they may be able to
Yeah.
move through it?
um yeah, so there's a bit of a misnomer that children are resilient. And what I mean by that is, quite often children don't present with the same language. They don't necessarily present with perhaps the same ability to communicate what's happened, where it was. Like I said, sometimes it's because they don't want to tell anybody where they were online, if you like. But children act out. They show you that it's a behavior thing. And what they will do is say, there was this really scary thing that happened. So I'm going to give you a recent example, which I've got permission to share from the mom, where a 6-year-old boy had been up in his bedroom playing with his device, and he'd watched a Peppa Pig video on YouTube. It was on YouTube Kids, and unfortunately, the person who put the videos together, so this is one of the things that happens online, they had changed the cartoon form of Peppa Pig to not tell a lovely story. It was to tell a story of Peppa Pig. How do I put this carefully? So in this particular video, Peppa Pig had taken her own skin off. That's the nicest way to put it. And this little boy was now frightened to go to bed. He was wet in the bed. He was as we call it in therapy, dysregulated at school. He was having behaviour issues. He couldn't sit still. So all of his presentations around what had happened were, I've been frightened by something, and all I can do is show you what has happened. And it took quite a bit of I think the mom said that she went through the history and came across the video, because they were trying to work out what he'd encountered so that they could work with him. And to begin with, I think there would be something. So if I just do this from a slightly different lens, I think one of the things that happens is, quite often teachers, parents will say, he won't go to bed. He's a 6-year-old. This is about a sleep disorder, or perhaps this is about misbehaving, and we label that kind of behavior. So what I'm noticing is, now this is it's not underpinned by theory. This is kind of my own thinking and musing around this. Is there's a lot of children at the moment who are being diagnosed with attention deficit disorders and inabilities to sit still, And of course, if they are coming across material like this, maybe their behavioural presentations are about the fact that they're struggling with something. Generally, I find the adults can say, I watched this thing, it was horrible. Like I could earlier, I could talk about what I watched. And what I find with the children is they don't generally come and tell you what's happened because there's a fear of getting into trouble. And that's that really is the distinction between how adults and children really present with this issue.
Mm, yeah, it's quite a difference. I was watching something that said, I follow a lot of parenting experts and whatnot, and I try to take what I feel like I can from them. But that children will come home after a hard day, particularly younger children, and they will ask you to play with them. They may not always say, Mom, I
Mhm.
had a really hard day. So and so was mean to me. It's kind of like they want your time. And it's
Yeah.
more like they go through an action of asking for your time because they want support, and they're not always able to communicate why it is that they need you in that moment, or even maybe relating back to why they're having this feeling. I
Mhm.
think sometimes I've noticed with my own children that I will have to connect those dots and say, I hate to say this, but I mistakenly took my daughter to a sort of it was like a daycare slash school with gymnastics, and I thought, well, this is great because I want her to be active. And she was 3 years old at the time, and I would kept picking her up from school, and she would just melt down. I mean, every time
Mhm.
without fail, it was like the worst expressions of her personality would come out the moment I would pick her up. And at first I was
Mhm.
like, maybe she's just tired. And then I really started to dive into it. And why is this? Because it's not typical of her to have this, but it's explosive. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. Like, shouldn't she be happy to see me? She's been away from me all day.
Yeah.
It didn't make a lot of sense. And as I started to do some research, and I would like to know if I'm correct in this, that she felt safe finally with me to let down all of her guard that maybe she had been
Yeah.
experiencing, having to shut it down all day. And later, I went to be able to review more of the things and the way that the school was structured, including a friend of mine who had an older child that actually told us the things that were being said to the children. Like, hey, shut up, quit crying. Nobody cares if you cry. This is what the adults were
Mhm.
saying behind closed doors. And I was thinking how horrible. And of course, feeling the guilt of the mother. My job is to protect my children and not leave them vulnerable without somebody who loves them like I do, to
Mhm.
be that safeguard, to be that safe place. But then it made sense. And I said,
Yeah.
okay, so her behavior was directly correlated with how she had been treated all day. And she couldn't tell me that, but she got to me and she let all the emotions come out because I'm mommy and I'm the safest place in
Mhm.
the world.
Yes. So, my favorite way to describe this to a lot of parents who have teenagers is when they say my daughter, my son, or maybe even non-binary child says "f off." I go, great. Like, I beg your pardon. That's so rude. Actually, and my heart was just thinking, oh my goodness, all of that time that she was in that space, and somebody was telling her, we don't care, we're not listening, we're not wanting to be in an interpersonal relationship with you, we're not seeing you and whatever's going on. All of that, and if you think of like a jar with marbles, and I say to parents, it's quite often these children are holding on to. There was that moment when, then there was that moment when, then there was that moment when, and unfortunately, they don't always have the language, and this can be even the adolescents. So what they do is they come to the nearest receptacle that they believe is safe, and in this case, it's you, and they go, "Have this jar of marbles," and you're expected to juggle them all and understand all of the different behaviours. So it is a bit of a meme, but all behaviour is a form of communication. And that's said near enough on every child training course in terms of working with children, being a teacher. All behaviour is a form of communication. So you have to look beyond the behaviour and try and work out what that communication is.
No. Well, it was pretty heartbreaking
Spot
for
on.
me when I put the
Mm,
dots together, but I was thankful to remove her. And then I did leave a comment on the review page when you look up there because I thought this is important, and I sat on that for a few months thinking,
mm,
should I do that? Should I just leave it be? But I thought, things are happening behind closed doors to children who cannot speak for themselves, who lack the
mm,
ability,
yeah.
and so
Well, that's
I had to leave the comment. It wasn't nasty, but it was truthful, and I said, don't put your kids
well,
here.
yeah, that's why people like me are. So I think on my website and in my bio, I am an activist in terms of on behalf of children because they do not have that capacity to do it. They don't always have the ability to do it, and certainly I know that it doesn't always come from a place of anything other than good intent from the adults. So I know a lot of the time we do tend to point at, and this is me going into compassionate mode now. This is what's happening is, maybe those teachers, maybe those instructors, maybe those coaches, maybe they've had a hard day. And the way that they deal with that is they look at these children and they say, I don't know how to meet you where you are. And I don't know how to manage your crying, your anger, your frustration. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you to just shut it. And by doing that, it gives you the opportunity as a parent. So I'm thinking about the time that one of my children came home and he said, Mrs. So and so shouted at me today, and it's not like Mrs. So and so to do the shouting. And what we did is probably he didn't feel all connected to at the moment. And we talked about, well, what happened before she shouted and what was going on, and it was just as everybody was going into the school and. She was trying to herd cats by the sound of it in terms of getting all these little children into the classroom, and we had a conversation about, so what could be going on? I'm just going to call her Mrs. Smith. So what could be going on for Mrs. Smith? Why do you think she was very shouty this morning? Well, and my son came out with, well, maybe her cat died. And I said, maybe that is what happened. And it isn't okay that she shouts at children. So we get to go in and we get to do well, I certainly got to do the cross mummy going in the following day to say, look, shouting at children really doesn't have a great impact. But one of the things that I hope with my children, and sometimes, especially if they're in a dysregulated state, I don't always see it, but there is that capacity for empathy. Now, in a trauma setting, I don't normally sit with my clients and go, "Well, what do you think the abuser was going through? What do you think that person who I don't know mugged you on the way home from school was going through?" Because that's not the right time to do it. And certainly that kind of compassion is something that people have to come to in their own time. But as a parent, yeah, we get to be cross on behalf of our children. And we get to use those moments to educate our children in, maybe the teacher was having a bad day, or maybe they're just a bit of an arsehole.
Yeah, well, if you're a fan of Dr. Gabor Mate, as I am, you begin to understand that trauma becomes generational. So likely the
Yeah.
way that you parent will be the way that you were parented, or at least quite similar. And I've had to work
Yeah.
quite hard myself to reverse some of the things that just the way that I was raised, that now I have the information and the wherewithal and the understanding that, oh, it could be done differently. We just assume, we don't really always take the stance of I could do it differently because we think, well, I came out fine. I hear people say that all the time. Well, I turned out fine
Hmm.
and I was spanked and I went to school with teachers that I didn't like and I had to listen and I'm fine. And sometimes I sit back and I say, but are you? You're here and you're existing and you're
Hmm.
maybe not, the worst person, but are you better for those moments or are you worse for those moments? And I sit back and think, well, my mom was a yeller. She really
Hmm.
was. She had a loud voice at most times of the day. She was very stressed. She loved us, had a really, really big heart. She always has, always will. She gives more, constantly more than she gets. So I always had a close relationship with my mother, knowing that love was the foundation of all she did. So,
Hmm.
again, I don't believe in parental blame, but um, she didn't shy away from a smack here and there if need be, and she screamed a lot. And I really had the thought, especially before I had children, and even probably into the first couple years of my daughter's life, well, spare this rod, spoil the child. Yeah, spanking
Hmm.
is okay here and there. And I have trouble to forgive myself sometimes for not, I don't think that I've hurt my children physically because that was never my intention, but there have been times when I have swatted their butt, and the emotional trauma, the rebound of that has been, it's heartbreaking, and it's hard to forgive myself for those moments when I lost my cool. I lost my calm, and I did
Hmm.
not handle it in a way, and part of the time I didn't know better. So it took me time to figure out how to regulate my own emotions, and then realizing, as hard as it is for me to regulate my emotions as a full-grown adult woman with a fully
Hmm.
developed brain, that I'm expecting my 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6-year-old who hasn't really begun to develop their frontal lobe to
Yeah.
process their emotions in a way that is superior to the way that I process my emotions. Like, the expectation wasn't very realistic there, and it kind of goes back to really trying to look at the behavior as a,
Hmm.
okay, well, I'm going to acknowledge this in a calm manner. Yes, they're melting down. Yes, they're freaking out. They're yelling at me. Maybe they're saying something that's triggering to me. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to say it out loud. I'm getting triggered. That helps me. It's one of the coping skills
Yeah.
that I have. Like, if I could say it out loud, then I have to recognize it. And then I have a chance to do it and try to keep myself in more of an executive state than a emotional or reactionary state.
Hmm.
And think about why my children are acting the way that they are, because my children are good. They are inherently good. I think all children are inherently good. So
Yeah.
what's going on? Like, how can I help them get through this emotion to the other side? And that has been very challenging for me. And it's even harder with, the world we live in digitally, because they're constantly exposed to things
Yeah.
that I don't want. And I have feel like the bad guy so much of the time. No, you can't watch this. We can't. Okay, we have to limit the screen time. Well, why can they have, why does everybody else? Well, I want a phone. So and so has a phone. I'm like, at the time you're 5. I'm not getting you a phone. Um, but it's really challenging, I think, to navigate in today's world with the amount of input that we get that we don't necessarily ask for or want. It comes at us
Hmm.
from all angles through these devices.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly what I call the I want. I want this, I want that, I want the other. And there is that is also about belonging. So one of the things I've kind of not talked about here in the why we do what we do online and why it can impact us so quickly and in such a varied manner is we want to be like everybody else. And for 3 and 4 and 5 year olds, it's I want that toy that Billy has. If Billy's got a toy, I want it because I'm omnipotent and I believe that everything should be mine, and so on and so forth. And then we move into a place of I want to be like my friends. So certainly around 7, 8, 9, it tends to be, well, they're wearing a t-shirt of um, I don't know, Taylor Swift. I want to wear a t-shirt of Taylor Swift because then I'm like that person. Then we start to delineate and get our real individuality when we get to adolescence. And we are compounded by the ever increasing advertising that's on these spaces, which is absolutely nonstop, whether it's on television, in between, the commercials, whether it's, scrolling through your feed on social media. It's really, really difficult because the amount of information that we are getting, and I'm going to quote Jim Quick here, it's like trying to drink water through a fire hose.
Oh, that's a great analogy. I just feel like it's being shoved down our throats, and it's a
Hmm.
very difficult world to navigate. So, do you believe in screen time, limiting screen time, and are there any tips or tricks, or, oh, I don't want to call them tricks because I feel like it's much more than that. It's not really a trick. I prefer transparency. But things that
Yeah.
help to regulate the world that our children are growing up in.
So, in terms of the word screen time, I believe it's a nonsense term because I'm just thinking by the time we've talked today, I will have had I don't know how many hours of screen time. However, it's all been productive for a particular reason. So what I'm going to do is give you the analogy. So often in the United Kingdom, I talk about city parks, but what I am going to do is I'm going to make it kind of relevant to you in the US. I'm going to talk about shopping malls. So we don't talk about shopping mall time. What we do is we really understand the environment. So what I'm going to say is when your children are 0 to 2 ish, they're generally in a buggy or a pushchair or some sort of pram, and we narrate. So a lot of parents will narrate. Oh, look over there. There's a doggy. Look over there. There's a so and so. And what we do is we help our children understand the environments we're going into. And when they get to about 3 or 4, maybe we've got them on the reins, but we certainly hold their hand and still talk to them about the environment we're in. And when they get to about 6 or 7, they might say, well, can I walk on my own? And you say, okay, you go on the escalator first, or you get in the lift, or I think you call it an elevator. And what we do is we give a little bit of freedom, but also we have it within a limitation of guardianship. And then when children get to about 11 to 13, somewhere between there, we would allow them to go off and do a little bit of shopping by themselves. But what we would say is, okay, here's where the emergency exits are. Here's where you can go and find help. Here's where the food shops are. Here's where I'll meet you. If you get stuck, go and look for somebody in this particular uniform. And, don't be going round near the car parks and spaces like that. Stay away from this particular area. Be careful of people like this. And also, we would guide them around the kinds of shops. So at the moment, I know that certainly in the Western world, there is a large number of children who are vaping. So we might talk about those kinds of shops. It's the same with the digital space. Children are, technology is here. It is part and parcel of every aspect of every person's life now. And I think at the moment we're at the point of, is it 5.2 or 5? It's well over 5 billion people who have access to internet ready devices. So what we're doing is we're educating them about the world's biggest mall. There are shops, there are people in those shops, there are items for sale, there are spaces that you don't really want your child going in. But also we need to give them the tools, going back to what we talked about earlier, where to report, where are the spaces they can go to talk about things that they've seen online, or where they want to go and report, and I know some people will, I don't know, spot a shoplifter and then they'll go and tell security. Well, it's the same kind of thing with the digital space. And again, this means that we've got to be parenting in a way that's we provide that guardianship without being the parent who checks, who does too much checking on rather than checking in. Is a way that I'm starting to talk about it, because it depends on what kind of device you get. It depends on whether it has parental controls. It depends on what you can access. And really, when it comes to, and it's often called digital parenting, we need to do the parenting in the same way we would allow a child to go and learn how to do things on their own and have independence. But also, we want to do it in a way that's supportive and not controlling, because, again, this goes back to the kind of research around parenting. Authoritative is the way that research shows that children can learn for themselves agency, autonomy, mastery, and lots of the skills that help them develop in the digital space, rather than the authoritarian, which is don't, can't, mustn't, and we don't want to be liberal, which is, yeah, of course you can go on your device until 11 o'clock at night talking to anybody that you want. I don't care.
That's very well said. I like the comparison and the idea of balance in all of that. I'll share what I personally try to do, and I'm almost getting to the point where I feel like I get so frustrated with the input. And even again, you mentioned earlier YouTube Kids.
Mhm.
It's so frustrating to me that this kind of material makes it on there. You think that you're choosing something that's going to be child friendly, and a lot of it is we have to educate ourselves, I think, on the things that are seemingly true and are not actually true.
Mhm.
Um, I'm almost to the point where I just wanna get DVDs and a DVD player and be like, "Okay, here's your Bluey, here's your Peppa Pig, here's your here's what you can watch." But no, we're not streaming because
Yeah.
I can't control the stream. I pretty much have X-nayed YouTube for the kids, unless it's something that I'm
Hmm.
sitting there watching with them to make sure that it doesn't just roll on to the next thing that becomes, nonsensical and
Yeah.
potentially damaging.
And yeah. And there is, so I know at the moment there's a lot of people attacking the tech industry, and I know that the tech industry has a long way to go in terms of protecting children. And I'm not giving them a caveat scot-free get out of jail card here. But when these environments were designed in the first instance, they weren't designed for children, and children came into those environments. And we're now trying to backtrack to protect children when they weren't officially and originally designed for children to be in those spaces. And certainly, the algorithms and the way that AI is now monitoring the content, often this is called user generated content. So that was like the video that I talked about with Peppa Pig earlier. It's really difficult for tech companies to be able to monitor all of this stuff all of the time. And as I said, if we just go back to over 5 billion people with the capacity to produce material and upload it onto the internet, onto platforms, onto applications, and in those spaces, it's a really, really difficult job for all of us to do what we need to do to monitor those spaces. So, this is a global societal issue. Tech can only produce tech interventions, and people have to produce human interventions. And yes, that does mean, so when I'm talking to parents in this office, I normally talk about, yes, this means you've got to go where your children are going. You've got to go into the environments of the gaming, let's just take Roblox, for example. You can go on to that particular game, and I think there's over 300,000 different games that a child could play. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to go and look at 300 um, different games that your child is playing, but taking an active interest. And what we've done, and this is not to parent blame, but what we've done, particularly over the last 27, 28 years of the internet being around, is made an assumption that the tech companies have provided the same level of safety and legislation that we would have in a corporeal setting. That would be, for example, in schools, in gymnastics clubs, in football clubs, in shopping malls, as I mentioned earlier. That we've made an assumption the same rules exist on the internet that exist in the real world, and that's not actually been the case. And quite often, and I think this is why the hoo-ha exists at the moment, quite often parents have been blamed, and certainly right now, with the way that we're talking about the Jonathan Haidt anxious generation, there is a lot of finger pointing going on to the parents. Well, you gave them the devices. What did you expect? You allowed them into these spaces, and the parents are frightened. They're feeling such shame that it's re-emerging as anger. And what that now means is everybody, and that's quite a grandiose phrase there, everybody that feels that way is going to want to do something about it. And when you feel powerless as a parent, you want to take away the thing that's causing the harm and the hurt. And this is why the push to remove social media, ban smartphones, etc., is happening at such a prolific rate. And what we haven't done is we haven't looked at this globally to say, okay, so we didn't know what we didn't know, and here we are where we can do better as parents. And to do that, we've got to go back to that empathy, compassion, really getting into the connections of, we made an assumption as parents that happened to be an incorrect assumption. So, what can we do now we have the information and we can move forward with it? Okay, this means I've got to be more of an active parent. And that can be really hard. I certainly know myself with my children growing up, the consoles were always in the living room. I watched what they were playing. I took an active interest in how they were communicating, because I didn't always understand some of the language. I would ask questions. What does that mean? Who are you talking to? How do you know that person's who they are? How can you check that profile? What are you watching now? Um, and I didn't allow them to go somewhere um, out of my ears and eye shot, really, because I didn't trust other people. It wasn't that I didn't trust my own children, it's I didn't trust the other people on the internet because of my background. So I took an active interest. And what I hear from parents in this therapy office is, I don't have time, Kath. I'm working three jobs. I don't understand the technology. What I put on in terms of, let's call it in the house. So I put these particular parameters on, these parental controls, but unfortunately, I'm separated from my partner, and they allow them onto all these things that I won't let them on. And again, another personal example, when Call of Duty came out in 2009, so this was Modern Warfare when this first came out. So I was working in this building where I am now. I'd said, no, it's an 18 rated game, you're not going on it. So my son decided to go around to one of his friends and he played it there and came home rather triumphant. I've just been on COD. So we can only do our best. And I think this is where we're at the moment, is this whole furore of anger and shame and parent blaming, and we need to be able to give ourselves a bit of a break here.
I think that's very well said. And it's easier said than done, though, because it does feel like, as the parent, it's my job. But the job is insurmountable. It's impossible. I can't quite
Mhm.
make the world comply in the way that I would like the standards of my home and my children to meet. So it is
Yeah.
extremely challenging to navigate this world, and then you hear the horror stories, and I think this is one of the disadvantages of social media is the fear. It's a bit like, I don't want to say it's fear mongering, but it's just that we have so much access to so much information all the time that we get a lot of the horror stories, or at least,
Mhm.
you watch the news and it's the worst case, and I just recently watched something from Roblox where this teacher of young, like middle school age, I think maybe 12-year-olds, went online, asked for the name, right, of the student to play Roblox with outside of school hours, and then began playing, then
Mhm.
began sending illicit images of herself, and now is facing jail time, but is claiming that she is pregnant with a 12-year-old's child. And
Mhm.
it scares me, but I see so much of that all the time. And I don't want to also be a helicopter parent where it's like we have to watch out for everything because it all could go wrong at exactly the same time, kind of fear as we
Yeah.
navigate this world. I don't know if you have any advice on that either.
I think there's something here to be said about, we can't be super parents all of the time. And acknowledging that in the first instance is part of this process, but also, I mean, that's the societal message, isn't it? You're the parent, you're supposed to, you should have known, why didn't you? And again, that's a trauma message that's coming down through the generation, because we don't see that actually this is the hardest job in the world. And if you are a digital parent, when your children are around, you have no time to do the cooking, you have no time to do the cleaning, you've got no time to clean the car. And we, as the adults, are expected to provide all of the other things. But I would say I mean, this is the speed is something to really comprehend here. But in the real world, there are also risks and dangers and pitfalls. And over the years, how many stories have we heard of children being kidnapped? How many stories have we heard of road traffic accidents? How many stories have we heard um, of roller coaster accidents? It could be anything.
Yeah.
So we can only ever do our best. And I think sometimes that's the self compassion around, I'm doing the best that I can with all of the tools that I have, and this is where education really, really is key. And again, conversations like we're having here, which is why I'm incredibly pleased to have these conversations. But this is why I'm writing the books, and this is why I'm trying to get information out there. But I want to do it in a way that isn't victim blaming. It doesn't finger point. It's trauma informed, and we need the whole of society to come together on this one. And what we're doing at the moment is and I often say this in the United Kingdom, we've got tech pointing at government, government pointing at schools, schools pointing at social workers, parents pointing at social workers, and so on. And all in the middle are children.
Right. Right in the eye of the storm. How many books
Hmm.
have you written and what are they? Yeah, what are they about? And I did want to point this out because I thought that this was really interesting when we were talking before we got on this podcast. We were talking about science and research and trying to distinguish what is a good study and what isn't. And we were talking about how that gets even more difficult for the layperson, and you have a formal
Hmm.
education, so you can look through a study, but even at times for you can be a bit confusing to try to really decipher all of it. And one thing that you said that I absolutely loved was that you wrote your first book and now, as you're writing your fourth, or am I a bit fifth? Okay, as you're writing
So
your fifth, you're
yes,
going to go
hang on a
back.
minute. I'm now going, hang on, one, two, three, four, yeah, fifth.
As you're writing your fifth book, you are going to go back and acknowledge some of the areas where you have now information that you didn't have then. So you're going to say, hey, this is an updated version of my opinion, and it may have shifted and it may have changed. And I love that. I think it's part of the reason why I resonate so well with you, is because I want to connect with people who can grow and who can admit,
Hmm.
hey, I didn't have all the information at this time. It's what I thought. It was my best intention. But I realized that maybe I was wrong right here, or I was wrong. I didn't have it all right. And I'm going to say what I think now. And I really do admire that. So, in your books, if you maybe would be able to list them off and just give us, a general of what they're about.
Yeah. So the first one, and when I say fifth, that's with Routledge. So I wrote um in 2016, I put a Kindle book up because at the time, and I'm going to be really, really kind of honest here in what my motivations were for writing the first official book. But I knew that there was a book coming out by a cyber psychologist, which again, in the psychology realm, we tend to come up with diagnoses, pathologies, and all the things in air quotes that are wrong with a person or why they're doing what they're doing. And I wanted to counter it with actually, these are the trends, these are the things that are happening, and this is how it ties into attachment and trauma. Now, when I wrote my first book with Routledge, which is called Children, Technology and Healthy Development, at the time, this is when really the first pieces of research and the first clickbait articles and the first real world of social media was starting to say, well, everything is down to social media or everything is down to the iPhone. I found a piece of research in this country and I allied with it because it met my expectations. And I wanted to say, oh yes, all of the research in the US is biased, and here's how it's biased, and here's how it's blaming a generation of children. Because I was angry. I was angry that we were blaming children. I was angry that we were making pathologies where we weren't looking at the story of the child. So I was biased. I was slightly sarcastic. I wanted to ally with researchers who I felt at the time also had opinions that I agreed with. And that is not a way to do research, because what I'd not done is gone right the way across the board. And then when it came to the second and third books, which are cyber trauma and online harms and sexual harms, sexual based online harms, that what I was starting to do was really talk about what was going on for the children. So the second and third book are mainly aimed at practitioners and people who work with children to say, okay, when you rush in or when you get I don't know, a referral that talks about a child been sexting, as it was called at the time, or a child has been sharing non-consensual images, or a child has been cyberbullying somebody else. Have a look at the context, take the story, and really work out what's going on for this child. And as I started to write those books, I started to do a lot more research. And then I went on to write the fourth, which is actually about cybersecurity and data protection. However, that is all about preventing trauma. So, how do professionals make sure that what they're doing digitally even, um, keeps account of a person's information, and how do you keep that confidential and secure? Because as therapists, we work with what I call the most sacrosanct data, which is people's wishes, desires, traumas, histories, and all of the rest of the stuff that we talk about. And then I was asked by the British Psychological Society and Routledge together to write a book, which I've kind of had to sit right at the beginning and say, okay, now I've gone into the research and now I've read, if you like, both sides of the debate. So in the book, I talk about the great Atlantic debate, and this is what's happening at the moment around smartphones and mental health, um, children and their well-being in a digital world. And I would find myself in really, really complicated psychobabble spaces where people were academically arguing with each other, which is the true nature of science, trying to disprove each other's theories, so to speak. But also, what I was finding is it was really, really difficult for the public to make sense of this information. So the book, and this book will be out in October, and it's called How to Manage Your Gaming and Social Media Habits. And I've got the word habits in particular. And for the first part of that book, it's really helping the public understand social sciences are really complicated. And we are more than neurotransmitters. We are more complicated than just experiencing an event. Like I talked when we first started talking, it's about interpersonal, intrapersonal, it's about context, it's about time, it's about age, it's about stages of development. And many of the public see the headlines, which might be, if we go back to Jean Twenge's 2017 article, I think it was, Have iPhones Destroyed a Generation? And it's those kind of headlines that make us go into that fear-based place that we talked about earlier. And right at the beginning of the book, I talked about I got it wrong. I got it wrong because I had a vested interest in wanting to ally with certain findings, because that helped me really fight for the children that I was fighting rather than reading the research, which is a really, really complicated process. And it's difficult and it's time consuming. And what I've spent the first part of the book doing is saying, well, when we see things like youth and social media, what do we even mean by those terms? How are we objectifying? How are we measuring? In academic speak, we talk about operationalization. What do we mean by these terms? And how have we studied it? And what does it mean when the study results are presented? And who's presenting those results? And what really matters when it comes to educating the public?
That's wonderful. I'm excited to read this book of yours when it does come out. And I appreciate so much your sharing. And I think what I'm going to take away from this is a better concept of how to find balance with my own children. And also, I really want to make sure that my children trust me and that they feel like they can talk to me about anything that feels odd or different, or, oh, that was kind of, Mom, I can come and talk to you. I always stress this to my daughter, because she's 6 and she practices, lying a little bit here. I think to almost to see, like, does that make it true? She's not really trying to be naughty with it. She's just exploring
Mhm.
what happens if I don't tell Mom exactly the truth. And when I know it's not the truth, then I say, honey, are you telling me the truth? Well, no, okay, this is exactly what happened. And I say, well, honey, I would really like it if you would just tell me the truth next time, because I'm not going to be upset with you ever if you tell me the truth. And I
Mm.
think that's such an important acknowledgement for parents in general, because we're too quick to get angry about the truth. But the truth is just what happened, and we're never going to make the right decisions all the time. And especially children will not make the right decisions all the time. And especially when you add social media, social pressures, electronics, all of the angles and the ways that the world can manipulate a child's brain, they will not make all the right decisions all the time. So the point in getting upset at the truth, I feel like is futile. I think it's more important to establish the relationship and connection
Hmm.
with your children to feel like they can always come and talk to you, and that the truth is not going to damage a relationship. It is not going to get them in trouble. Sorry, mom, I know that you told me you didn't want me to go to this page, but I did. And here's what happened. My teacher did this, and I know that I wasn't supposed to, but I'm sorry. And here's my situation. I would rather have this kind of relationship where my
Yeah.
child knows that they can come and talk to me about anything, and that as long as it's the truth, that my reaction will be supportive and I will help them get through it.
Yeah, and internally you can do the screaming. Now
Yeah.
that's the skill of a parent. Is
Very fair. Very fair
yeah,
point. Catherine, you are amazing, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time today to educate us on navigating this very difficult world with the future generations. And I feel like we're playing catch up, because I was from a generation that didn't have these phones so early. I really feel like I was the last of the generation to not have this be such a presence in my formative years. And it's a bit scary thinking about navigating it without having the experience firsthand. So I do appreciate professionals like you who work with children and parents and people who face all kinds of traumas through the digital world that we live in. So I do appreciate your expertise today, and thank you so much.
oh, thank you. And can I just add in, should we book in when we get into the VR, and then should we book in when we get into the haptic feedback, and then should we book in because yeah, the world is moving very, very fast.
It absolutely is. All right. Thank you so much, Catherine. And I will continue to follow you and look out for your book that's coming soon.